My name is David, possibly. I'm a second-year postdoc in the Scalable Solvers group. I work with Chao Yang. So we develop efficient eigensolvers suitable for massively parallel architectures. Today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some of the more recent work that I've been doing on parallel shift-invert spectrum slicing, specifically as it relates to the self-consistent eigenvalue problem. And that's a really complicated way to say that I work on electronic structure problems for their eigenvalue computations. So really the reason that we want to work on any of these things is because physics simulations are pretty central nowadays to DOE initiatives, including molecular discovery and materials design. So anything from energy production and storage to the development of these quantum materials, physics simulations are going to be pretty central to design these materials. And the reason for that is that experiments are hard. There's a lot of variables. There's a lot of things to consider when you're trying to develop these things, so you don't want to waste your time. And along those same lines, experiments are expensive. There's a monetary cost associated with doing these things. So if you mess up, it's going to cost actual taxpayer dollars. So kind of the workhorse, at least in materials design, is this kind of electronic structure theory. And really what this is the study of molecular properties. And this is actually my background for my PhD. So electronic structure is kind of probing the electronic wave function of a many-body system in some clever way. Obviously, we can't solve the n-body problem exactly. And through these methods, we're able to probe molecular structure. We're able to simulate spectroscopies and able to get properties like kinetics and mechanisms. So this isn't just one method, right? There's no electronic structure method that exists that covers all of these possibilities. So there are many possible methods in this field, and they all have a variable cost to accuracy ratio. So kind of on the lower end, where you can simulate very large systems for a relatively low cost, there's these DFT type methods which scale cubically with system size. And you can get more expensive, so things like perturbation theory, which formally scales n-fifth, and couple cluster, which is what I did during my PhD, which scales n6 or n7 if you do some perturbative corrections. And you can see that these kind of more expensive methods, you can't really simulate very large systems. These scale with time very, very quickly. So in order to simulate large materials that we're going to want to do for materials design for energy or quantum materials, we're going to have to stick to these DFT simulations within reason. So kind of what we want to do is we want to make these simulations faster at the end of the day. So we're going to focus on these DFT type methods. And really, in order to speed these things up on massively parallel architectures, we have to identify the bottleneck. And as it stands today, the bottleneck in DFT calculations is the solving of this nonlinear eigenvalue problem through the self-consistent field procedure, which involves a rather large-scale diagonalization, a repeated and a large-scale diagonalization. So essentially what we do is we solve this nonlinear eigenvalue problem through some variant of a fixed point iteration. There's acceleration techniques that exist, but they're not terribly important for this talk. And the general scheme of an SCF procedure is we create some guess at the wave function, we form some representation of the Hamiltonian, we solve some eigenvalue problem, we determine whether or not we've converged those set of eigenvectors that we're interested in. If we haven't, we have to go back and do this over and over again, and if we have, we can terminate the calculation. And the goal of this is to minimize some energy functional over some subset of the eigenvectors that we're going to be playing with. So the reason that we need to develop a new eigensolver, right, there's thousands of them, or thousands of implementations of them at least, is that existing methodologies don't scale well on massively parallel architectures for various reasons. So kind of the traditional approach to solving these eigenvalue problems is direct diagonalization through some sort of a method that you can find in LAPACK or ScalePACK, or more recently things like ELPA. Using direct methods, we're able to solve problems on the order of 100,000 using thousands of CPUs. This has the benefit of being exact. We're getting all of the eigenvectors for a specified operator, but we exhibit very poor strong scaling because we're heavily communication bound. You can see that these strong scaling curves for even like kind of medium-sized problems are almost parabolic at a large number of resources. And the reason for, and I mean, this is a medium-sized problem, so maybe this is kind of pathological, but all of these strong scaling curves eventually invert because of the communication overhead. Also, we're unable to exploit sparsity in these direct solvers, and because of current limitations on GPU implementations, we're very limited in size that we're able to play with on the GPU. for these types of methods. So kind of on the other side is we're able to solve these things iteratively through Krylov subspace techniques, so things like Landshaw, slot PCG, GPLHR. And using these types of methods, we're able to solve tens of millions of degrees of freedom pretty easily on tens of thousands of CPUs. And this has the benefit of having a targeted determination of a certain set of eigenvectors. So if I'm only interested in a subset, I can obtain those directly. And also, it doesn't require storage of the matrix. All I need to know is some application of the matrix on some trial set, and then I solve the eigenvalue problem by projection. But the problem with these Krylov methods at scale is that they have a lot of serial bottlenecks, so they're very bound by Amdahl's law. And also, because we have to solve the direct problem using some direct, or the projected problem using some direct method, we're going to end up with the exact same problems asymptotically that we had with the direct methods because we end up having to solve this projected eigenvalue problem. So the problem with these methods is that they're general, right? They will solve any problem that you throw at them. So general methods are for general problems, but we have a very structured problem where we need to iterate over these eigenvalue calculations until convergence. So in order to obtain real performance gains, we need to be able to exploit the structure of the problem and kind of more recent advances in modern computing architectures. So there's two features of the SCF problem that I really want to exploit in the development of this eigensolver. And the first is that the SCF is iterative, right? So we have a guess, we're going to iterate it down into a minimum. So the accuracy of any particular iteration is not terribly important until you get close to convergence. So the actual obtaining of some sort of accuracy can be amortized over the entire SCF procedure. So the accuracy of the eigenvectors that I want really only need to be of the same order as the change in energy or some RMSD difference in my in the span of my eigenvectors. And also you can see here in this kind of simple example of a benzene and NWCAMX that the SCF convergence is rather smooth. There aren't jagged, discontinuous parts of the SCF procedure, which means that the eigenvectors of the previous iteration tend to have a similar span, especially towards convergence. So we can utilize that information to bootstrap the next set of iterations. And the second, from a computing architecture perspective, is that flops are cheap nowadays, especially versus communication. So we've had an increasing reliance on things like accelerators, so we're able to do many, many more floating point operations on a single node than we were able to previously. But when we have cheap floating point operations, we're going to be exposing communication. So the issue is that we're going to be communication bound more quickly with these accelerator type models than we were 10 years ago. So just to kind of give you a basic example of kind of a small problem, just performing a 10,000 by 10,000 matrix multiplication on a GPU, it takes 3 times more time to send the information to the GPU and retrieve the result than it did to actually just run the gem completely. So we're heavily communication bound in that respect. So we developed this method called the SISLICE method, which is a parallel shift-invert spectrum slicing method specifically for the SCF eigenvalue problem, and we have a archive paper detailing the kind of gory details of how this thing is implemented. But kind of the basic idea is that we want to partition the spectrum, the actual eigenvalues in a particular spectrum, into separate tasks. And the way that we're going to do that, so here we have some set of eigenvalues. We're going to break it up because our spectrum is real valued. We can break it up in terms of some set of shifts. And we want to treat each one of these blocks of the eigenvalues and their associated eigenvectors independently. I put independent in quotes because in practice that's not actually feasible. You can't have to be completely independent, but you can be as close as humanly possible. And what we're going to do is we're going to trade a certain amount of redundant floating point operations. We're going to do a lot of redundant work on each individual computing unit in trade for having less communication overall. So the way that we're going to do this spectrum filtering, because in principle this is an easy concept, but in practice is not so easy, is that we're going to apply a spectral filter onto our matrix to damp out the contributions of certain eigenvectors and eigenvalues that we don't want and amplify those that we do. So if we could in principle create an approximation to a step function, we could just break up each of these individual spectral slices through subsequent step function approximations and do the spectrum slicing that way. But in practice, this is not a possible function to approximate exactly. We can get close to Chebyshev polynomials, but then we have to go to very, very high degrees of polynomials in order to get to that. So a more practical solution to this is to filter. So instead of just damping out completely the contributions of the eigenvalues that we don't want, we're going to disproportionately amplify the contributions of the eigenvalues that we do want, such that we can throw away a lot of redundant information without actually damping it out completely. So you can see in the step function, we have these hard boundaries where the eigenvalues that we don't want are completely damped out, whereas the boundary is more soft in the shift-invert spectral function. So, but if you look at the scale here on the left, this is still several orders of magnitude between this, inside the region that we want and don't. So the amplification is going to be very, it'll be useful there, I guess. So the way that we're going to do shift-invert spectrum slicing is we're going to, on each one of the shifts that we broke up the spectrum with, we're going to create a basis using the shift-invert spectral function, which is just the application of an inverse operator on some set of basis. So this does still scale formally n cubed, so we're not going to be reducing the scaling of this method, but we are trading it for something that has a better strong scaling behavior, so linear system solves. And also we're going to be able to exploit sparsity, so we're going to be able to use something like SuperLE or SymPack to solve these linear systems at scale using many more resources than you were capable of doing with the diagonalization. And of course, GPU implementations of linear solvers are much more advanced than those of diagonalization. But like I said before, we're going to be doing a lot more floating point operations, so we're going to have to come up with a scheme to avoid communication in this algorithm. So this is not a new idea. People have been doing this for, I guess, since the 80s. But implementations of this method, as they currently stand, have had difficulty expressing massive concurrency because they rely on some sequential shift selection. So they perform some discretization of their spectral region of interest, they obtain eigenvalues at each one of those pieces, then they do another set of shift selections based on those approximations, et cetera, et cetera. So the SISLICE method tries to exploit the SCF eigenvalue problem. So if we're in the first SCF iteration, we're just going to perform some crude discretization or partition of our spectrum, perform our shift-invert iterations in parallel, and then extract the eigenvectors. But then in subsequent SCF iterations, rather than doing all the work of obtaining the partitioning of the spectrum, we're just going to update the spectrum partition based on the previous SCF iteration. And the key here is that in this algorithm is that there's only one point of synchronization as we have it implemented, and that's in between the shift-invert iterations and the extraction of the desired eigenvectors. So the way that we're going to do the spectrum partitioning initially is through this density of states approximation to the spectrum. The details of this are not terribly important, but the key is that through a fixed set of Landshas iterations, I'm able to obtain a smooth approximation to the eigenvalue distribution through some linear combinations of Gaussians. So the peaks of this smooth function represent kind of eigenvalue clusters in some crude way, such that we're able to integrate over these clusters to obtain shift selections in some approximate manner. So we're able to, for the entire spectrum or spectral region of interest, obtain all of the shifts all at once, such that each of the shift-invert iterations can be done completely independently. So there's no subsequent shift addition after the first round of shift-invert iterations like current implementations. So once we have a set of approximations that we've obtained in parallel, we have to validate to make sure that we didn't double count eigenvectors or are missing eigenvectors in some spectral region in the domain that we're interested in. And the way that we do that is through the realization that because our spectral function is so steeply peaked at the shifts that we choose, the approximations closer to the shifts, so in some spectral region of overlap here that I've highlighted with this circle, you're going to end up with redundant approximations on two adjacent spectral shifts to the same set of eigenvalues. We choose the ones that are located closer to the shift that they were obtained on as the reasonable approximation because of the amplification near the shift. So what we do is we count all, so we take two adjacent spectral shifts, we get all the approximations in those bounds, we compare that to an exact count of eigenvalues in that spectral bound, which you can obtain as a byproduct of the triangular factorization that we had to do to solve the linear systems. So it's just the difference of the number of negative diagonal elements of these diagonal matrices that we're able to obtain from the LDLT factorization. And if we have more eigenvalues than what's in that bound, we throw away the ones with the largest residual. That seems to be a pretty reasonable thing to do. And then, because the density of states approximation can be a rather crude partition of the spectrum, we're actually able to amortize the optimal shift selection over the SCF as well. So even though we may have a crude approximation to the density of, or to the proper shift selection, where maybe we have some shifts that are in regions that don't have many eigenvalues, through clustering of the previous set of eigenvalue approximations, we're able to iteratively update the shift selections throughout the SCF such that those converge at roughly the same rate as the SCF converges. So both of these schemes, both the shift generation, migration, and validation schemes, only require low volume information to be communicated. So we're not communicating the eigenvectors themselves, unlike other methods which require some sort of tests of mutual orthogonality. So we can do one synchronization of which the latency can be completely hidden with RMA, and all of the shift or the eigenvalue validation, shift, migration, all of these sorts of things can be replicated on each rank without any communication afterwards. So it's only one synchronization step of low volume data. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we did, we chose this SIO, SI5 problem, which is rather small, but it's very sensitive to the accuracy of any particular SCF iteration. And also, this exhibits multiple regimes of eigenvalue distributions in the same spectrum, where we have localized eigenvalue clusters, which represent our core electrons. And then over above our Fermi level, we have some set of more continuously distributed eigenvalues. They're still discrete, but they're closer together. So we were able to show that the SISLICE method does exhibit the proper convergence for the SCF. We can see that even though the approximation that we made that we have a set of, or that our SCF iterations are completely smooth, this SCF actually does have a jagged jump in both the span of the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues throughout the SCF. But we're able to show that the k-mean shift migration is able to account for that non-smoothness in the SCF iteration. And then we're actually able to recover both from the SCF and from the shift selection. And from a performance perspective, we exhibit, as we would expect with low communication overhead, a linear speed up for a large numbers of resources. So this is a sparse matrix that we were able to obtain from the US sparse matrix collection. It's about 17K, so it's still a medium to small size problem, but we're able to get roughly a 2.7 speed up minimum time solution on more resources, right? So this is the fact that these direct methods invert in their strong scaling, so there is a absolute minimum that you can obtain, which at a pretty low number of resources. So if we add more resources, we're still able to continue to speed up and have a lower time to solution. I am out of time, so I will skip the GPU stuff. If you have questions about it, let me know. So in conclusion, DOS estimation for the spectrum allows us to express more concurrency through not having to add more shifts each SCF iteration. The clustering allows for a dynamic tracking of the eigenvalues throughout the SCF's procedure. And because we have a low communication overhead, this is going to offer, I guess, a robust and high performance alternative for a lot of DFT calculations in the future. Our money, thanks.
Does this depend on the exact type of functional that you're using? Like if you use something that makes it special blocking?
So we asked if this depends on the specific functional that we're using. In general, no. Right. So this is just, I mean, it's going to depend on the characteristics more of the physical system than it does on the functional, and obviously there is some interplay there, right? So we've also run this on pseudo-potential calculations where we don't have those localized clusters and it's more of just a uniform eigenvalue distribution. And we've seen that it actually performs better in those cases. This is kind of a worst case scenario in terms of localized eigenvalue clusters. Yeah, so not in terms of the functional, but more in terms of the physical system that we're modeling, because it's going to depend on the eigenvalue distribution, which of course is going to also, to some extent, depend on basis sets and functionals and things like that.
Because I noticed like some other algorithms have a lot of trouble going from like the standard DFT to like DFT that has to be blocked, because like
Sure.
overall like some
Right, because the eigenvalue distribution in those things is going to be inherently different, because you're going to be capturing different aspects of the physics, which are going to pull eigenvalues apart or cram them closer together.
How close do you have to end up being with your density of state? And if you gave your approximation with Gaussian, you said it was fairly low.
So he asked how close do we have to be for the density of states approximation, and we can be very crude, come to find out. Especially if you're in these pseudopotential calculations where you don't have these localized clusters. If it's essentially a uniform distribution of eigenvalues, you can put shifts wherever you want to, for the most part. It does have the ability to capture some non-uniformity in these kind of more continuous eigenvalue distributions. But yeah, you can be very crude, and then the clustering mechanisms that we have subsequently are able to account for any issues that we had in the initial shift selection.
And do you have plans of putting it on like periodic systems? Because I noticed those are all.
Yeah, I mean, we've already applied it to periodic systems through the DGDFT software. Awesome, thanks.
Thank you.